Hey, Carol, thank you for coming in. You are doing so much across so many different communities, both regionally and locally and nationally and globally. And I'm just amazed. Just an outstanding life history of contribution, and continuing because you're so young yet and you're continuing this journey. So thank you for coming in and sharing all of this with our audience.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Stephen.
When I look at your background and I look at this outstanding history, as I mentioned, accomplishment and contribution, and just making a difference in so many different ways, I'm curious. What were maybe two or three inflection points that created this wonderful person that you are, this wonderful leader that you are today?
Thank you. I think sometimes it's so interesting, Stephen. The answers can be so basic and in a way so random. I had the pleasure during my YPO journey of being the host chair for the Denver Global Leadership Conference in 2011. And you get to bring your personality to these roles in YPO. I'm a Denver native, very outdoorsy, very, we care about our Rocky Mountains. And I had an underlying theme at the time in, again, 2011 of leave no trace. When you go hiking, when you grow up in Colorado, you go hiking, you bring in and you pack it back out anything that you've got. And so we were going to have an experience of leave no trace. And it was avant-garde at the time. We had reusable water bottles and water stations, and it was wild and crazy that we would ask our attendees to reuse a water bottle. But we really had an impact, and we wanted to minimize the trash that was created by this global conference. And it went well, and we did achieve much of what we aspired to. But the following year, we traveled to Singapore, where we were drinking out of 8-ounce single-use plastic bottles. And what that spurred in me was that we had to have some institutional level change, not just an individual at the head of a conference. So that was a big turning point for me, is that it had to be institutional.
That's fascinating, and I can see that institutional aspect of all these different pivotal moments in your career, and all of this different narratives that make up this wonderful person that you are, Carol. So that's a really interesting story, and it weaves in
So simple.
YPO.
It's so simplistic. That's what I think is intriguing about it, Stephen.
Yeah, and you weave in YPO. So just for the audience who may not be familiar with YPO, YPO is this wonderful organization. It's over 70 years old, over 30,000 executives coming together and sharing and enabling and empowering by all of that sharing, and employing about 22 million across over 140 countries, 450 chapters. They run thousands of events and
Nine
things like that.
trillion in revenue across the organization. So a
Yeah, it's amazing
significant,
impact.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
and I know there's this barrier to get in. So since you mentioned YPO, um, how do you get in? So talk about your personal sort of entrepreneurship
Sure,
journey and
sure.
what that was like. And then, of course, then you got into YPO, and there's this barrier or challenge. You had to hit this barrier, this hurdle to get into YPO. So maybe you can talk about that, but infuse it with this entrepreneurial side of who you are.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. So my company, Tatonka Capital Corporation, was started in 1993. And like many leaders, I was experiencing the loneliness at the top. You separate yourself from your peers, and it happens slowly and in some cases accidentally. And so finding YPO at the time that I joined, there was which is 20 plus years ago, by the way, it was a threshold of being a CEO under the age of 40, and also reaching a US revenue of $8 million. Today, the threshold has moved to under the age of 45, as we're all getting younger in that journey. And I believe the threshold is 12 million US revenue. And what that does, Stephen, is it brings everybody that you meet inside of YPO has this minimum experience level of what they've been managing to or what they've been leading. So it gives a camaraderie, frankly, that is gender and culturally neutral because of the economic and the age requirement. So yeah, 450 chapters worldwide, and it's been a priceless organization for me. My business is very U.S. centric. I'm focused on public finance in the U.S. and public education in the U.S. And what I like to say about YPO is that it's brought me the world. It's taken me out into the rest of the world to have these types of conversations.
You're a successful entrepreneur because you met the barrier, this sort of hurdle to get into YPO, and you know, it's a really interesting organization because of this vetting process that occurs. So let's talk about the entrepreneurship journey in more detail, because it's harder for women. It's harder for women to raise capital. It's harder for women to start a company, and there's this sort of bias that's always been there for many, well, for millennia, you know, for thousands of years, right? So, you know, what were the catalysts to say, you know what, I'm going to start this business? Was it from your family, or just you just felt driven to be an entrepreneur?
Yeah, well,
and tell us more about your business.
There was no business plan. I can tell you that. I can look back, and I have a history in my family of strong entrepreneurial women, certainly in a different shape and form. But my grandmother and my mother had beauty salons. So I grew up, I can now look back and know that I had models who were working 24/7 to contribute to the family household. The husbands in that line were more linear, professional engineers, as my dad's and my husband's trade. And I think that's an interesting combination, frankly. I have a very supportive spouse, I have to say that, who is very linear in his aerospace engineering. And I tend to be the what if, how about this? Let's move there. So it's a very nice combination. And I actually was never held down by my spouse. So that's a big point. With respect to the journey, Stephen, I had an opportunity. I was a successful underwriter of public finance transactions for a national bank who wanted to put a cap on my earnings because I had done too well. And that pushed me out into the marketplace. And I had somebody step forward, and I wouldn't have known these words at the time. Frankly, I was 31 years old, but they were my capital backer. But I never had to go seek capital in the traditional sense. It was basically brought to me. And we fill niches. I think one of my skills personally is to identify inefficient niches in gigantic markets. Public finance is trillions of dollars annually here in the US. And we were performing at about $100 million a year, which is a smidgen of the marketplace. We never needed market share, but the value that we brought to those customers was because there really was no other source. When I describe my competitors, it would be Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, Deutsche Bank. And yet, when I was in my sweet spot, of course, there was no competition because they wouldn't do what I could do, and vice versa. And we just grew.
So, I mean, you would provide capital, you know, government capital, right, to companies and things like that, and so on.
Happy to share. What we do is we provide, a municipality from the federal government down to the local park and rec district, they buy every sort of widget or service you can imagine, and they pay for it on time in many circumstances. And so we would supply capital to the vendor who's been awarded a government contract and whose traditional banker doesn't understand the nature of a government contract. They come with a wide array of risks and termination clauses that the traditional banker is just not privy to, frankly. Again, another key to my business was transactional size, tended to be $5 million and under, because the banker who had the background and frankly sophistication to do the transaction was looking for that $30 million transaction, not that $1.2 million transaction. So our primary customers are vendors who are supplying widgets and services to governmental entities. And we can change that vendor's life. And that vendor, across the board, all of the projects are called essential use. So they're all contributing to the government good, to the good of society. We've financed schoolhouses and rescue vehicles, satellite uplink equipment, telephone systems, aircraft aircraft simulators for training for the Navy, just the widest variety of capital asset that you can imagine, each one providing a governmental service.
You were able to identify an area of the market that wasn't being addressed, and you addressed it, and that's how you grew this business, and a top business in that sector because of that.
It's interesting, actually, Stephen, that this business that you and I are talking about now, that was the original core business that Tatonka Capital started. That market has completely matured. It's about the industry itself is probably 40, 50 years old. I entered it when it was, maybe 15, 20 years old, and the market has completely matured. We're really not functioning in that space because the large institutions now recognize and understand the minimal risk that was there, and it's been commoditized. There's no margin in it anymore. So we've moved on to the public education sector, and we're helping provide district level services to public charter schools in the country.
Okay, so let's mine that in more detail. Let's talk about that.
Pivot.
You saw this whole area of which you were, filling a need, and you did very well. And then you decided to do a pivot, and the pivot is because it's being commoditized. The big players are moving in, and then you have to shift that business. Were you able to see the warning signs or some of the flags that you needed to do this early on? And so when you did the shift, or what were the indicators? What was that like to go through that transition?
What it was like, it's often not necessarily fun, because when you've got a thriving market niche going on, of course, change there is always hard. But yes, it tends to follow trends, and it's again very basic, Stephen. It's the narrowing of margins. What we would find in a transaction where we might charge 5 points to do a transaction, now banks are charging $500. A flat fee, a minimal small flat fee. So it does present itself over time, and I think that is one of my skills, is to look. I love reading reports. I'm a reader, and I love numbers, and I can identify trends. So looking back, my company will be actually 30 years old in this coming February. And looking back over those 30 years, we've probably pivoted 5 times. I'm not sure the external world can see that as well as I can see it. But yeah, the markets, just the margins closing. And so we moved into this back office services space in education, primarily because we're very good at managing governmental money. We understand the procurement process of government entities and how to have that money flow through, if you will, for the needed services. And so that was started the summer of 2015. And I tell people all the time, Stephen, education is much harder than finance. It's a lot harder. um, and you're in the financial services world too. There can be, some heavy hitters in that space. What I find in education is in the US is that there's a weight, and it comes down from our federal government constantly telling people not good enough, constantly telling our uh, academic administrators not good enough, and our academic instructors or teachers not good enough, and frankly, our students not good enough. And that's something that we're hoping to change inside of our organization to start to get rid of that feeling of not good enough. It's hard.
That it's just a fascinating. I mean, it's a complete pivot, right? In many respects, but yet because you have these core skills and core knowledge and expertise, you can still leverage that into another sector. So that's why you established Tatonka Education Services.
Yep.
Yeah, Tatonka, yeah. Education Service, or TES, and it's a public benefit corporation, right? So
right.
Why the public benefit corporation?
Very specifically, it's very common in the education space for companies to form as not-for-profits. And we looked at that and did a lot of research, and we just didn't feel that that was genuine, frankly. A lot of money flows through a lot of not-for-profits, and there's a lot of wealth created in not-for-profits, and it's just not our background. But so we went the for-profit route because it's who we are, and it's really what the aim is. Our aim is for-profit, but we did see the company as something where we have the ability to have an impact, again, to a wider stakeholder base, frankly. And I've still got a good mountain to climb, but I would love to find both my company, and we're working on it, as well as the industry, paying teachers for their contribution to society. I say things like that, Stephen, and sometimes the pushback is, well, we can't pay, teachers 6 figures. We can't afford. And I'm not talking about necessarily, making teachers the wealthiest profession on the planet, but I do think there's plenty of room to pay teachers for their contribution to society. And so that's where we're sort of focused inside of this umbrella of education, is on our teachers and our employees, and just raising up, frankly, how society feels about the teaching profession. It's taken a hit.
You founded a company, right? Tatonka Capital. Then this became Tatonka Education Services. But there's the name Tatonka. Where does that come from?
Sure, absolutely. Well, again, simple story. First off, I needed a name. I was leaving a national bank, and the competitors in that public finance space are government funding group, Public Lending Corporation. They're a little too boring for me, Stephen. And I'm again in Denver, Colorado, and we have the CU Buffaloes. So there's the whole Western, feel. So Tatonka is the Lakota Sioux name for the American bison. And I happened to be, I just stumbled upon a little essay about how the American bison is the monarch of the plains, vitality, strength. It really was the backbone of part of the American experience, if you will, for our country. And so it resonated with me. And I love to say we have buffalo everywhere, Stephen, in my office, and I could not have paid a sum of money for the branding that we received, but it was just the symbology of the American bison. I think it does embody who we are as a company and our personality. And there's wonderful, very old. If you remember US West, it was one of the old Mountain Bell telephone companies. They had a ad campaign that are two male bison, going, and it says, "Bring on the competition." And we've always kind of embodied that "bring on the competition" spirit. So it's about standing proud.
That's a fascinating narrative, a story, the roots of both of these companies, and the fact that you were able to transition successfully. And, you're about success, right? And your schools, the customer succeeding, and you're bringing down costs, you're maximizing efficiencies, you're putting money to use at the school sites, and you're still
Yes.
maintaining this triple bottom line. And you have three grown children, charter school kids as well. So there's that aspect. So about good management impacting kids' lives because you've done it personally within your
It
home,
has
right?
served the market served my children very well. They went to so charter schools are schools of choice in the US. They're public schools, but they provide a different operating. You have a choice of, I describe them as different operating systems. It's like choosing between a Mac and a PC, but you still have to deliver education through them. My three children went to a K-5 school that had a operating platform driven by Outward Bound, the large outdoor exploration company out of the Northeast. And so their education was all centered on problem solving. And frankly, Stephen, I can see it. They're in their late 20s and early 30s, and I can see it in their daily lives, that experience. And so that too very much drove our looking at that industry and wanting to bring some influence and some skill sets. The average founder of a charter school has a philosophical approach, as I said, an operating system that they're bringing, and they're not thinking about the business of the school. That's what we do.
Yeah, and you have this great expertise of doing it, right? I mean, of being an entrepreneur and all of this history that you have. So in systems and programs and generating win-win scenarios of doing that across
Win-win,
all of
yes.
the different roles, right? As an entrepreneur too, the lesson is you have resilience and you have grit and perseverance and there's volatility when you're an entrepreneur, and you have to manage and ride that volatility through that persistence, resilience. So you're exhibiting all of that, and that's sort of the lifeblood of YPO as well. So let's get in more now into the YPO. We talked about it earlier. You mentioned that you've been a YPO member for more than a couple of decades, right? And you've got a U.S. Focused business, but your participation has been global. So let's talk about that. Well, you met the initial threshold to join YPO. How long did that onboarding process take? And how did you find out about YPO? Did you have friends in YPO or?
No, I had a vendor who is about 15 years older than me that I'm still friends with, who led me there. He gave an introduction. And I think that's a common actually experience for certainly my generation of YPO member. There also was a push at the time, Stephen, this was the early 2000s, to find more female members. They definitely were attempting to make a diversification. The process, it can be slow at times, but it is because it's member led and members have day jobs. So I would balance that slowness with it's really the volunteer member who's working that process. So it probably took 9 months to become a full member, to go through the interview process. And at the time of my membership, things were very geographic driven. My business has always been national, and it also basically follows population centers. So primarily Midwest to the Northeast and then the West Coast. So I really didn't have business connections here locally in Denver. not a big population center. And so that connection to YPO and its geographic base at the time connected me to local business leaders that I didn't know, that have become my friends. But as today, YPO, what's allowed me to really go global with YPO, besides the various conferences that they put on, is the advent of networks. And networks are interest-based, either industry or business focused, personal interest. And then you and I met through YPO's impact networks, which are focused on the 17 UN SDGs and have a focus on people, planet, peace. And then the network that I'm the chair of, which is a Sustainable Business Network, or Business as a Force for Good.
So I hear from your journey, then you're a successful entrepreneur and you're working with vendors, and this vendor who is older would be a YPO member, and was thinking Carol would make a great YPOer because of her energy, her commitment, her entrepreneurship spirit. She meets the threshold. And so the vendor does an introduction and you go through this process, right? Because they have to check you out, because YPO, they'll vet you.
Yes.
And you got to go through this process to make sure you meet the
you have
criteria.
a third-party certification. You have to supply a third-party certification, so they vet you.
Okay, then you finally get something. You must got a letter or something saying you're in, and then you're part of, I guess, a chapter. What is that like? And so describe that process before we get into the global work. So because the audience doesn't know.
Sure, absolutely. At the local chapter experience level, YPO operates on an academic calendar, so July to June, and the core of YPO's, I think, member interactions are about lifelong learning and idea exchange. And so at the chapter levels, individuals have stepped forward into officer roles to put on what we call an education year. And those are very wide in their experience based on the size of chapter and based on the enthusiasm or the connections of the champion that is the current learning officer. But what happens as an individual member is that you're going to have an opportunity to participate in probably anywhere between 10 and 20 to 25 learning events with your chapter. And one of the things, and the learning events come through the interest level of that current officer, the current learning officer of that calendar year or that academic year. And the intent is to bring forward exposure to ideas and opinions that might not actually be your own, that are the person next to you, and it's their interest, and it's their, you're seeing it through their eyes and their vantage point. And an early lesson was for myself and my husband, because YPO does embrace spouse partners in the entire journey. Early on, we sort of found ourselves picking and choosing things. Oh, I'm not really interested in that. Oh, I don't need to go to that. And that was a huge mistake, because really that is where the growth, as we all know, being challenged is where the growth happens. And so to the future YPOers out there, the real benefit is going and participating in those events that you don't think you have an interest in, that you don't agree with. You're going to get exposure, the unprecedented exposure to, again, the vantage point of somebody that you can lay some trust with, because you've got this peer experience in meeting those YPO thresholds.
It's interesting that you pick this up, because there's research to indicate that as well. Some researchers indicate that 50% of success is because of diverse thinking, diverse people networks, and you have to engage. You have to, as you mentioned, sort of get out of your comfort zone and stretch your boundaries, and you do that. You could clearly, I could see that throughout your career. So, and you have these really intimate sharing, and because this is public through other interviews I've done with YPOers, you call them forums. So
Right.
what was that first like when you first got introduced to a forum? Because you didn't know these existed in
You,
this way, right? So
correct. Yeah, the forum experience, which is basically a small group and a cone of confidentiality. So it's a lot of trust that you lend the people that you participate with. Um, it's freeing, and it's also a burden because you tell your story. And what is interesting in my mind about forum, and when I share with people, there is a selfish tension that takes place inside of forum. To really get something out of it, you need to be selfish about what you want and what you're willing to give. But to get your forum mates, the other members of your forum, to do the same, you have to be present and available. So you can't be, solely selfish, or your other forum mates will leave. But yeah, so I find it to be like this tension, Stephen, and it's a selfish tension where you have to get and give very equally at the same time.
yeah, and in the intimacy would just build an incredible level of engagement, and as you indicated, very trust driven, right? Because you're
I'll
sharing.
tell you, I've been in two primary forums, and you have people that tell stories that they've been in forum, for 20 plus years. That hasn't been my personal experience. For me, forum has been a wonderful experience at different points of time. But I did join a woman's forum through the Women's Business Network, which I was a member of, and was part of their leadership team for a time. And that was a uniquely special experience. It lasted for about 8 years. And I'll tell you, I never thought I needed a women's group. Let me put that out there. I would have joined NABO in the US if I thought I needed a women's business leadership group. And so I was sort of that female member that didn't think I needed to hang out with other female leaders. And I had a girlfriend twist my arm that brought me into that part of the organization, Stephen, and it was a priceless experience.
Yeah, because there'll be so much shared learnings as well, and there is bias out there, and you have to fight that bias and
I wouldn't
cultural
say that
shifts.
I don't feel like I've personally, can I look back over a 30 plus year career and
Right.
see a few points? I like to say every once in a while I have somebody who speaks to me like they're patting me on the head to tell me good job. Um, that's less and less as I've gotten older, let me say that too. But I don't think personally, Stephen, that I have experienced a ton of bias, certainly not for being a woman. I probably experienced some age bias, frankly. I think that it might have started my company because of the large, national bank, thinking I was too young to be doing what I was doing. But I don't want to undervalue the bias. And that was one thing that I learned in participating with the Women's Business Network. The global experience of female leaders is not necessarily the good experience that I had. There are very challenging experiences out there.
So let's talk even further about YPO, because it's been interwoven into your life in so many different ways, including your family, right? So I'm sure your kids were YNGers, so YPO next generation,
Yep.
and your husband as a spouse, they're
He's
embedded.
been in a male spouse forum for I think it's 18 years.
Right. So, and you're the recipient of the YPO Best of the Best Network Worldwide in 2012, and that's as a Women's Business Network Chair.
Yeah.
Can you describe that journey to become the Women's Business Network chair, and then and some tips, lessons from that?
Again, about 10 years ago, and so there was networks were still finding their way at the time, which leads for opportunity with the leadership, because I think my most significant influence with the Women's Business Network was focusing on depth of bench in leadership for the network itself. We took actually, looking back, we took a 9-year focus. The leadership journey inside of the networks tends to be a 3-year journey. And there were 3 of us that lined up with a united focus on what we wanted to do for the network. So we got to build on each other's shoulders year after year. And probably the most significant things that we did do is we demonstrated a depth of bench, where we brought in a wide global executive committee. We made a very concerted effort to get out of North America. YPO has its challenges, and it's interesting, they're somewhat cultural. North Americans are volunteers in a way that you don't always see all over the globe, and YPO is definitely about volunteering. But we made an effort to expand our executive committee on a global level into YPO's super regions. And then we also focused on bringing in the male members of YPO into the Women's Business Network organization. And we changed our focus to from being about us as female leaders to being about female leadership in general, focusing on their daughters, focusing on their employees, and those female women in their organizations that may not be rising to the C-suite, but are moving up into middle management. So we greatly broadened the focus of the Women's Business Network. In the early days, it was about just finding each other. I happened to get to participate during a time where the focus went much larger, and it went outside of our organization, which was a great pleasure.
The coming together of transformational women in a CEO-led organization, which is member-focused, would be an amazing experience, and a great opportunity as well, right? To bring together all these contributions, right? So do you find that the lessons learned and the influence that you've had on YPO are continuing and growing from that initiative? Or, what systemic changes were you able to create, or opportunities, I guess, within the greater YPO?
I actually want to share a kind of funny story with you that you just triggered. And this is more of a personal transformation with respect to WBN. In finance, it was a man's world. Certainly, again, for my generation, I found myself at the table, the only woman. Certainly, that was the norm. It wasn't unusual, because it was the usual for me to be the only woman in the room, and that was never really a challenge for me. Sitting down that first time as the chair of an executive committee that was made up, we were probably 14 female CEOs. That put me outside of my element. I have never, I'm a saleswoman at heart. I'm a salesman at heart, Stephen. And so I can work a room. I can pick up, what is going to be the leverage points. I'll never forget the fear of leading those 14 female executives. And, so that in itself pushed me. And that is part of the legacy. Certainly being in the education space, it is much more heavily dominated by women here in the US, not necessarily at the higher executive or administrative levels, but certainly at the staff levels. And so I think WBN trained me to help, use my skills in reading culturally the room of a group of women, not just a group of men who were working on a transaction. Within YPO, I think the the change. There has been a shift in recognizing, I believe, what women can do in member organization and their businesses. I do believe that we caused a bit of an awakening in the human capital inside of our member company businesses. It's changed. It's not, it's just not avant-garde anymore. It's expected. And I do think that YPO, through its reach, had a big part of that. I share in my bio that we participated and helped launch Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In effort. I think that, you can find Lean In circles in most large organizations globally. And the Women's Business Network really supported. We launched 80 circles for her globally for her kickoff. So it's now out there. It's permeated everyday life, everyday corporate life.
That's just outstanding. And I'm just going to list some of the other things you've done before, and then I want to get into the Global Impact Summit that you're doing and your co-chair and the work you're doing on the YPO Impact Networks Council. But you remember the YPO International Learning Committee from 2009 to 2012. Again, amazing work. Recipient of the YPO Best Chapter worldwide in 2009 as YPO Rocky Mountain Chapter Chair. You already talked about the YPO earlier, about the YPO Global Leadership Conference in Denver, Colorado in 2011, where you were host chair, and you said there's so many lessons from that. We've already talked about the Best of the Best Network, the Worldwide 2012, being the Women's Business Network chair, a member of the YPO International Events Committee, iconic events portfolio lead from 2019 to 2022. Just outstanding leadership of this organization. But now let's focus on this first of its kind event that's being held. And so what led you to become the chair of the YPO Sustainable Business Network, which is part of the YPO Impact Networks Council? So what led you to that journey? And then what led you to being the co-chair of the YPO Global Impact Summit? And what do you hope to accomplish and so on? So, okay, so let's spend the rest of the time on that. So you're now the chair of the YPO Sustainable Business Network. How did that happen? What created the synergy for that?
Well, clearly I can't keep my hand behind my back. So a big part of the YPO experience is just putting your name forward, frankly, Stephen. But what drew me to the Sustainable Business Network really goes back to that first story with 2011, where I wanted to get involved in providing some institutional change for an organization that has given me so much. So it started small by joining the network and just participating in their discussion board conversations, and I like to say nicking away at YPO in causing some change, or maybe nudging, a little shoving here and there. And we've had some good success in that. But I'm just I know that I'm going to get back tenfold from what I put in. So I'm at my core, I'm a volunteer, and I'm a gatherer of people. My skill is not necessarily a industry expertise, but I can bring together people across industries and across product groups. So I think that's probably what led me to the chair position of SBN, and the faith of my fellow members in nominating me and putting in that role, is that I do have the skill of rallying the troops. And so it's in that role that led me to co-chair the Global Impact Summit coming up in February of 2023. And it's been an interesting journey in that role, Stephen, because the YPO Impact networks, as I mentioned, are focused on the 17 UN SDGs, and there's a lot of time spent on just providing educational resources. What does that mean? What I love about the SDGs myself is that they released me from having to solve every problem. I think there's a level of being overwhelmed by some of our global challenges. And when you read about the background and the thought of the SDGs, it was to just pick and choose where you can have impact and where you can focus. And my business focus is in quality education and decent work. So employment and education. I can do something in those two places. I cannot personally, change our water crisis. So that's what I love about the SDGs. Across the 4 networks, we're focused on all of them, so you can have an effort in all of them. The Impact Summit had its origins and in spreading understanding about how people can get involved, either personally or through their businesses. And that's the mission of the Impact Networks as a group. What has happened in this particular summit, and I think this will ebb and flow, Stephen, we're going to a relatively remote location in Costa Rica. And at the end of the day, if you're a skeptic, you're not going to travel that distance. You're just, it's too hard to get to. But where it's going to be a relatively small group at about 150 people. Everyone there has already bought into having a focus on impact and purpose and sustainability. And I really want to add for the listeners that sustainability is about, for me, it's about my business living beyond me, carrying out its work. Sustainability is sometimes used, in my opinion, too narrowly. I can't get that word out, but we're too defined. It's about being sustainable. And we won't be sustainable if we don't serve our customers, our employers, our employees, our capital sources, our suppliers. It's that whole universe of people and entities that keep a business open. So that's my personal interest in SBN. And we're going to have this amazing setting where we are going to have people that are all headed in a similar direction. So I really think what we're going to have a chance to do is accelerate what all of us are working on by just being together for those 4 days.
And you, as co-chair, what do you hope to achieve as an outcome that you think you're going to be able to do some systemic opportunity catalyzation within YPO and beyond?
Right. And we've already seen some change, Stephen. So again, I think the systemic change that we want to see is just continuing to have people be more comfortable with being with attributing their business focuses to a sustainable focus. And I think there's a lot of hang up around language. If I literally just say the word or color green, different people are going to have physical reactions to the word or color green. I'm hoping that we can get past that. I think I think there's a lot of people like me out there. I'm a stakeholder capitalist. I would not have used that terminology 10 years ago. I would have told you that I'm a win-win business leader. But really, win-win, stakeholder capitalism, it's all the same thing. I don't need a loser to be a winner. And I've never, my business never had that approach. I think there are I think most entrepreneurial companies are focused in that manner. And I think what has happened in the advent of politicizing some of these words has caused people to step away from things that they're already doing it. They already have a sustainable practice in their business. They already care about their suppliers and their customers and their employees. But we've taken language and it's gotten a little bit twisted. So I think the systemic change coming out of the GIS will be the enthusiasm. Because it's such a small group, people are being turned away from attending. That's going to create a buzz in itself. scarcity, can be a good thing at times, but we're already seeing it permeate the rest of the organization. There's not a network I can think of that hasn't had a program around this subject matter on their calendar. So it's out there.
So we're down to our last question. And this question is, what sort of last messages or recommendations do you want to leave the audience?
Oh gosh, whew, that's a big question. I think it's the point that I was just making, to not let language get in the way of sharing ideas about sustainable businesses, and probably, Stephen, the people that are listening to your programming probably have bought in on some level, I'm imagining. And so it's when they find themselves in conversations. I had a conversation with a dear friend, and I was talking about changing YPO systemically, and he rolled his eyes at me. He, physically rolled his eyes. I'll save naming him here. And I said, but all I want to do is have less trash. And he said, oh, well, I can get on board for that. Less trash is good. And that was this aha about how language is getting in the way of us getting on similar path. And so that's what I would share with your audience, is if you find yourself in a conversation that, feels a little barrier or deadlocked, look to change the language and try to get down to a common language, like no trash. It's hard to be against less trash.
Some great recommendations. Carol, you're doing amazing work. You're an outstanding executive across so many different areas, and I thank you for coming in and sharing so many of your joyful insights and opportunities with our audience. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for having me and giving me that reflection. It's also a gift, so I appreciate that.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.